fire was tearing through his home. The firefighters stood still, and within minutes, the man they ignored would turn the entire department and the city upside down. The quiet hum of an autumn night shattered in an instant, replaced by the crackle of fire and the sharp scent of smoke. Orange and red flames leapt hungrily from the windows of DeAndre Washington's modest two-story home, painting the dark sky with a furious glow. Neighbors emerged in robes and slippers, clutching phones, murmuring in disbelief. The shriek of sirens cut through the air, promising help, but when the fire truck screeched to a stop, hope didn't arrive with it. Captain Rodriguez stepped down from the cab slowly, his boots hitting the pavement with deliberate weight. He didn't rush. He didn't even glance toward the blaze. Instead, he crossed his arms over his chest and stood like a man surveying a minor inconvenience, not an emergency. Behind him, firefighters Thompson and Miller leaned casually against the truck, thumbs scrolling across their phone screens, faces lit not by the fire, but by TikTok videos. "Sir, please, you have to help me." DeAndre's voice cracked, raw from shouting over the roar of the flames. He stood in his pajamas and slippers, his breath turning to vapor in the cool air, hands gesturing desperately toward the inferno consuming his life. "My wife's medical equipment is inside, her ventilator and all our family photos. Please." Rodriguez tilted his head slightly, the faintest smirk tugging at his lips. "You think this city owes you? It doesn't owe you a damn thing." The words dropped heavy into the smoky air, colder than the night itself. Thompson chuckled without looking up from his phone. Miller let out a low whistle, as if this was some sort of spectacle meant for their amusement. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, murmurs growing sharper. DeAndre took a step closer to Rodriguez, but the captain didn't move, didn't blink. His eyes flicked over DeAndre like he was cataloging a nuisance. "We'll get to it," Rodriguez added lazily, "when it's worth getting to." The house groaned under the strain of the fire. A window on the second floor exploded outward, sending shards of glass onto the lawn. The heat hit the crowd in a wave, and still, the equipment stayed locked in the compartments of the truck. DeAndre's breathing quickened, not from fear, but from the growing realization that these men weren't here to help. He glanced toward the driveway, where his black Mercedes sedan sat gleaming even in the dim light, its chrome catching flickers of fire. The license plate read City 001, a small sticker from City Hall clinging to the lower corner of the windshield. If anyone noticed, they didn't react. In the shifting light, his wrist caught a brief reflection, the subtle gleam of a Patek Philippe watch, a piece that didn't belong to a man anyone should dismiss. But Rodriguez's eyes never left DeAndre's face, and they held nothing but practiced disdain. A gust of wind fanned the flames higher, sending a shower of sparks skyward. Somewhere inside, the crack of splintering wood echoed like a warning. "You have to understand," DeAndre tried again, voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "Those things inside, they're not replaceable." Rodriguez gave a short, humorless laugh. "Neither is my time," he said, turning his head slightly toward Thompson and Miller. "Boys, we'll assess, might be a lost cause anyway." The two nodded without looking up, their inaction a silent pact. Around them, the neighborhood watched in growing disbelief. The air was thick, not just with smoke, but with a tension that felt ready to ignite on its own. Some pulled out their phones, filming the scene, their lenses catching the sharp contrast between a burning home and the idle men sworn to protect it. DeAndre stood still for a long moment, jaw tightening, shoulders squaring, his eyes reflecting both the fire and something else, something the men in front of him hadn't recognized yet. If they had, they might have moved faster. But in that moment, the night belonged to the flames, and the men in uniform seemed perfectly content to let them burn. From the second-story window of the house across the street, Kesha Johnson stood frozen, her phone clutched in her hand as the glow from the burning home danced across her face. She could see every cruel detail from here, Rodriguez with his arms folded, Thompson and Miller scrolling their phones, and DeAndre standing in the driveway, framed by the blaze, pleading for someone to do their job. Her finger hovered over the record button. For a moment, she hesitated. Maybe someone else was already filming. Maybe the fire department would finally snap into action. But then she saw Rodriguez turn his head toward DeAndre, smirk, and shake it slowly, as if denying a child a toy. That was it. She tapped the button and whispered into the camera, "If I don't stream this, nobody's gonna believe it happened in 2025. The reflection of the fire lit up the glass of her phone, making the image look almost surreal. First viewers popped into the stream. 2, 4, 12. Comments appeared instantly. "Where is this? Is that the fire department? Why aren't they moving? She angled the camera to catch the fire truck parked like a barricade in the driveway, the idle hoses coiled tight inside the compartments. Down on the street, Mrs. Chen, the elderly woman from next door, pushed through the small crowd gathering at the edge of the lawn. She waved her hands toward the captain. This is wrong, help him. The fire's getting worse. Her voice carried with the urgency of someone who had lived long enough to recognize when something was dangerously off. Rodriguez didn't even look at her. Step back, ma'am, he said in a tone that was more dismissal than instruction. He turned his back on her and the flames at the same time, his eyes flicking down to his watch as if counting down to some private schedule. Kesha caught every second on her feed. Viewers were climbing, now over 100. The comment thread moving faster. This is insane. Get the address. Someone call the news. Her camera followed DeAndre for a moment. He wasn't pacing, wasn't shouting. His movements were controlled, deliberate, like a man calculating each second. Even through the thick haze, there were details that stood out. The gleam of a Patek Philippe on his wrist when he lifted a hand. The smooth black paint of the Mercedes in the driveway with its crisp City 001 plate and a discreet City Hall sticker in the corner of the windshield. None of it matched the dismissive assumptions being thrown his way. You'll see this. Kesha's voice sharpened as she adjusted her angle to get all three firefighters in frame. They're just standing there. The whole house is burning. The viewer count jumped again. 400, 700. The comments got louder, angrier. Where's the chief? This is criminal. Call your local station. Mrs. Chen tried again, her small frame braced against the heat rolling off the blaze. Do your job, she shouted, pointing toward the second floor as a curtain of sparks poured out of a window. Rodriguez didn't even flinch. He glanced at Thompson, who shrugged, eyes still glued to his phone, and at Miller, who stifled a yawn. Kesha zoomed in, making sure the world could see their faces in the flickering firelight. The air on the street was changing. Neighbors who had come out in slippers and blankets were pulling out their own phones now, pointing lenses at the firefighters instead of the fire. The quiet disbelief was shifting into something else, collective outrage. Kesha kept talking to her audience, feeding the details as they happened. That man's wife's medical equipment is in there, he told them. They don't care, look at them, look. One viewer dropped the address in the chat. Another said they'd called a local news desk. The number in the corner of her screen hit 1,000, then 1,200. The comments scrolled too fast to read. The fire roared behind DeAndre, the orange light throwing his calm, steady expression into sharp relief. He didn't look like a man broken by the loss unfolding behind him. He looked like a man biding his time. Somewhere in that, the audience could sense it. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. 15 minutes had crawled by since the first truck arrived, and the fire was no longer confined to the living room. Flames had climbed the staircase, curling into the master bedroom, chewing through walls and beams with a hunger that left no doubt the house's bones were weakening. The air shimmered with heat. Across the street, the crowd had thickened, their voices growing more urgent, the smell of smoke clinging to their clothes. The wail of a second siren cut through the night, and a white SUV swung into view, red and blue lights strobing across the scene. Chief Patricia Hawkins stepped out, posture straight, eyes scanning the blaze like a veteran sizing up a battlefield. She had barely taken 3 steps toward the fire truck when Rodriguez intercepted her, clipboard in hand, voice adopting that practiced, neutral tone reserved for official reports. Routine structure fire, Chief, he said, loud enough for nearby residents to hear. Immediate life threat. Assessing resource allocation protocols. Hawkins' gaze shifted to the unmoving crew, then back to Rodriguez, her brow tightening. And what's blocking the driveway? She asked. Rodriguez didn't blink. Safety precaution, securing the perimeter. The truth was written in the scene itself. The fire truck sat squarely in front of DeAndre's Mercedes, angled just enough to make the narrow driveway impassable. Hoses still coiled, ladders still strapped in place. From the sidewalk, it looked less like safety and more like a deliberate wall between the burning home and any chance of help. Inside the growing crowd, a few people exchanged glances. The deliberate positioning wasn't lost on them. Cameras and phones all caught the same image, a truck parked to obstruct, not to serve. Kesha's livestream comments erupted. They're blocking him in. That's intentional. Someone call the station right now. Hawkins took a step toward the truck, but Rodriguez's voice pulled her back. We may need to divert to Elmwood, he continued, as if reading from a script. Reported structure fire there, possible entrapment, higher value property density. The last phrase landed like an insult in the thick smoke. Elmwood, everyone in Riverside knew it was the wealthy, predominantly white neighborhood across town. DeAndre didn't flinch, but his jaw tightened just enough for Kesha's zoomed-in shot to catch it. The message was clear. His home didn't rate the urgency of Elmwood's. Channel 7 van rolled up just as Rodriguez finished speaking. Jessica Martinez stepped out with her cameraman, her eyes taking in the fire, the idle firefighters, the untouched equipment. Her crew started filming immediately, catching the tableau in wide, damning shots. The blaze at full fury, the captain chatting with his chief, the blocked driveway. She caught Hawkins' expression too, part irritation, part calculation. In Kesha's stream, the viewer count spiked again. Over 2,000 now. Comments scrolled so fast they blurred. He's just standing there. This is sabotage. Every second counts. On the street, Mrs. Chen shouted over the noise. Elmwood, you came running when the Hendersons' pool house caught fire last month. Her voice cracked with both age and fury. Rodriguez didn't look at her. His eyes stayed on Hawkins as though the residents were nothing but background noise. Hawkins hesitated from where she stood. The house was still savable with immediate action, but every minute made that less true. The decision hung in the smoky air, the weight of it pressing down on the crowd. DeAndre said nothing. His stillness was unnerving in its own way. It wasn't resignation, it was restraint, like a man watching his opponents dig themselves deeper. The cameraman swung his lens to the truck blocking the driveway, then back to the unmoving crew. It was all there, recorded in unforgiving detail. Anyone watching could see it now. This wasn't neglect born of incompetence. This was obstruction, calculated and intentional. The fire roared higher, casting a furious orange halo over the street as the crowd pressed in closer. Heat shimmered off the pavement, the smoke thick enough to sting the eyes. Rodriguez's voice cut through the chaos, casual and cruel. Let Elmwood know we're on our way. This one's not worth the water. His words landed like sparks in dry grass, igniting a ripple of disbelief through the people gathered. Phones tilted forward, lenses catching every syllable. DeAndre moved then, slow and deliberate, crossing the short distance to the fire truck. The heavy metal latches of the equipment compartment clicked under his hand. He pulled it open with the ease of someone who had every right to be there. The gleam of unused hoses and tools glinted in the firelight. Rodriguez reacted instantly, shoving through the onlookers, boots slamming against the pavement. "Hey, you can't touch that," he barked, his tone the sharp edge of authority he'd been leaning on all night. But DeAndre didn't flinch. He turned his head slightly, meeting Rodriguez's eyes for the first time with a calm that was almost unnerving. The captain was close enough now to see the faint reflection of the flames in those eyes, but there was something else there too, something he hadn't accounted for. DeAndre let the silence stretch a beat longer than necessary, letting the tension coil tight. Then, with the faintest trace of a cold smile, he said, "Actually, you work for me." The words weren't loud, but they carried, slicing through the noise of the fire and the murmurs of the crowd. A murmur of confusion swept over the onlookers, quickly replaced by a collective intake of breath, as DeAndre reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a black leather wallet. He flipped it open with practiced precision, the gold seal catching the firelight. Mayor DeAndre Washington. The title was right there in bold, undeniable print. For a second, time seemed to stumble. Rodriguez's expression froze, his mouth half open. Behind him, Thompson's phone lowered slowly, the screen still glowing. Miller shifted his weight uncomfortably, eyes darting to the crowd. Kesha's live-stream chat exploded, the viewer count leaping in real time, 3,000, then 4, then 5. Comments poured in so fast they blurred. "He's the mayor. Are you kidding me? This is insane, Mrs." Chen gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Someone near the back shouted, "That's our mayor." Another voice rose above the din. "You idiots, that's Mayor Washington." The energy shifted instantly. What had been quiet disbelief transformed into an almost electric current pulsing through the crowd. The man they'd watched be dismissed, insulted, and ignored was the most powerful official in the city, and now everyone knew it. Cameras and phones pivoted to catch Rodriguez's face, his confident mask cracking under the weight of the revelation. The captain stepped back without realizing it, as if distance might undo the damage already done. But there was no going back. DeAndre didn't move toward him, didn't raise his voice. He simply held the badge steady in the firelight, letting every person there and every person watching online see it for themselves. The twist was complete. The balance of power had shifted in a single sentence, and Rodriguez, for the first time that night, had no words. The street had become a public hearing under the glow of firelight. The flames were still alive inside the house, but no one's eyes were on the blaze anymore. All attention was locked on the man in pajamas and slippers who now stood like a judge, presiding over his own courtroom. News cameras from Channel 7 streamed live, Kesha's feed climbing past 6,000 viewers, phones held high in every direction. DeAndre faced Chief Hawkins, his voice calm but edged with the authority of someone who had signed her paycheck more than once. "Chief, you will relieve Captain Rodriguez of duty immediately, pending investigation," he said, his words deliberate. The crowd quieted as if sensing the shift from confrontation to command. Hawkins hesitated, glancing toward Rodriguez, who stood stiffly by the truck, jaw clenched. DeAndre didn't press yet. Instead, he reached down to the black leather briefcase on the hood of his car, flipped the locks, and let the wind catch the corner of a stack of papers inside. "Before we proceed, I want to make something clear," he said, and then he stopped speaking. The silence stretched. The fire crackled. Somewhere in the crowd, someone coughed. Even the live stream comments seemed to slow, as if everyone watching was holding their breath. Only when every eye and every lens was on him did DeAndre continue. "The Riverside Fire Department's annual budget is $47.2 million, he began. "Your salary, Captain Rodriguez, is $89,400 a year. Thompson, $62,000. Miller, $58,000. All of it taxpayer-funded. All of it overseen by the City Council, which I chair." The numbers hit like clean punches, each one precise, undeniable. Rodriguez shifted his weight, glancing toward Hawkins for support. But she was staring at the papers in DeAndre's hands. "Now," DeAndre went on, "let's talk about protocol. City VIP addresses, elected officials, judges, emergency command are automatically flagged in our dispatch system with code 77 Alpha. That code means priority 1 response. Tonight, that code was in place for this address. It was ignored." A low murmur rolled through the crowd, like the first gust before a storm. Kesha's chat exploded again. "They ignored a 77 Alpha? That's deliberate. Someone tagged the DOJ." DeAndre held up his phone, screen glowing in the firelight. "This," he said, "is the dispatch confirmation for tonight. You can all see the alert code. Yet for over 20 minutes, this crew assessed my home as, what was it, Captain? Not worth the water." Rodriguez's mouth tightened into a thin line, but he didn't speak. The cameras caught his silence like blood in the water. Hawkins' posture stiffened. She had worked long enough to know what this meant, not just for Rodriguez, but for her department. "The federal standard," DeAndre continued, "requires a 4-minute response time for structure fires. 4 minutes. You gave me 20. Average property loss increases 15% for every minute of delay. That's roughly $700,000 in preventable damage to this property. That loss is now the city's liability." He let the words hang, the weight of the figure settling over the scene. People in the crowd exchanged wide-eyed looks. Hawkins cleared her throat, her voice suddenly tight. "Mayor Washington, I was not aware. That's the problem," DeAndre cut in. Still calm, but with a steel edge. "You weren't aware because your captain made sure you weren't. And if it hadn't been for this community, for these cameras, for this live stream, you wouldn't be aware now." The pause that followed wasn't long, but it was heavy enough to make the air feel thicker. Hawkins' eyes flicked toward Rodriguez again, and this time there was no sympathy in them. "Effective immediately," she said finally, her voice loud enough for the microphones. "Captain Rodriguez is suspended pending full investigation." A ripple of reaction ran through the crowd, gasps, murmurs, even a few cheers. Rodriguez tried to speak, but Hawkins' raised hand cut him off. DeAndre didn't smile. He simply looked from one firefighter to the next. "Every second you wasted tonight was a second someone's life could have been on the line. You ignored a direct priority alert because of your own bias. You gambled with the safety of this community. And you lost." The cameras caught every word, every flinch, every shifting boot. In that moment, the fire behind them seemed almost secondary. The real blaze was in the street, public trust set alight by proof, data, and the undeniable fact that the man they had underestimated had come prepared for this exact fight. The flames still chewed at the upper floor, but the true heat in the street had shifted. Every camera, every phone, every reporter's microphone was aimed at DeAndre Washington. Chief Hawkins stepped forward, her voice tight but trying for control. "Mr. Mayor, this may be a miscommunication. A breakdown in—" DeAndre cut her off before she could finish. "Miscommunication doesn't last 20 minutes, Chief. Miscommunication doesn't involve blocking a driveway, ignoring a 77 Alpha, and telling my neighbors their lives aren't worth the water." Rodriguez, pale and sweating, tried to salvage what little ground he had left. "Sir, I have a right to due process." DeAndre turned to him, his voice dropping to a measured, dangerous calm. "Reform or watch the feds reform it for you." The words landed like a gavel strike. You could feel the current shift again, the crowd leaning in. The livestream comment section spiking with a flood of all-caps reactions. Without looking away from Rodriguez, DeAndre reached into his briefcase and pulled out a sleek black tablet. With a swipe, the screen came to life, displaying a polished interface. "This is the Riverside Response Tracker," he announced, turning the screen so the cameras could see. "Real-time tracking of emergency response times across every neighborhood in this city. Public, transparent, unalterable. Citizens can see when a call comes in, who's dispatched, and how long it takes them to arrive." He let the words settle before continuing. "Effective immediately, we're implementing this system. Every emergency response, every crew, every call, logged and visible to the people paying for it." Hawkins' lips parted in surprise. She had expected anger. She had not expected a fully formed technological reform package in the middle of Burning Street. DeAndre wasn't done. "Here are the conditions," he said, lifting his gaze to meet hers. 1. Mandatory quarterly bias training developed by civil rights experts for every member of this department. 2. Random response time audits conducted by a civilian oversight board with subpoena power. 3. Residency requirements for all new hires. If you serve here, you live here. 4. Diversity recruitment benchmarks for every hiring cycle. 5. Performance reviews tied directly to response time data. Rodriguez shifted, opening his mouth, but Hawkins silenced him with a glance. The cameras caught every twitch of his jaw, every blink, as if each movement underlined how little power he had left. DeAndre continued, his tone steady, measured, and amplified by the authority of someone who had been building this moment brick by brick. "You will agree to these conditions on record, in front of the people watching here, in front of the city, in front of the country. Or we will let the Department of Justice take over your department, piece by piece, until there's nothing left to resist." Hawkins glanced at the reporters, at the phones raised high, at the knowledge that every word would be dissected on the evening news. She knew the choice wasn't really a choice at all. "Mayor Washington," she said finally, her voice firm but stripped of resistance, "we will accept your conditions, all of them, effective immediately." The crowd reacted with a low swell of approval, like a collective exhale after holding their breath too long. Kesha's viewer count jumped past 8,000, her chat filled with lines like "This is history," and "He came ready for war." DeAndre nodded once, acknowledging her answer, then turned the tablet fully toward the cameras. "This app will be live to the public within 30 days. Any delays will be documented, every anomaly explained. When performance is transparent, bias dies in daylight." Rodriguez muttered something under his breath, but DeAndre didn't even glance his way. The captain's relevance was over. What mattered now was the architecture of change being built right in front of the people who would benefit from it. The fire still raged, but the conversation in the street was no longer about whether this house would be saved. It was about how no house, in any neighborhood, would ever be left to burn again because of prejudice. That was the twist the crowd felt deep in their bones. This wasn't a man settling a personal score. This was a man who had come armed with the tools to tear out the rot and rebuild the system in real time, in full view of everyone who had been told for years that nothing could change. Tonight proved otherwise. 3 months later, the glow of that October night had faded from the skyline, but its shadow still stretched over Riverside. In the mayor's office, sunlight spilled across neatly stacked reports, each one tracking response times, bias training attendance, and community oversight meetings. The Riverside Response Tracker app was now live in every major city department, its dashboard projected on a wall screen like a heartbeat the public could watch in real time. In the fire department, the names on the roster had changed. Captain Rodriguez's was gone. His termination had been finalized within a week of the incident, the official reason, a mix of policy violation and gross misconduct. But the true sentence had come later. Civil suits from DeAndre's family and 2 other households he had ignored landed him in court, his savings drained before the first hearing concluded. When the verdict arrived, it wasn't prison, but it was ruin, damages in the hundreds of thousands, personal liability he couldn't escape. The house in Elmwood Park, the one he had boasted about to his crew, went up for sale within days. The local paper ran the photo of him walking out of the courthouse after the ruling. Shoulders hunched, suit rumpled, head bent low. Gone was the captain who had stood smirking in front of a burning home, arms folded like a man untouchable. Now he moved like someone careful not to meet the eyes of the crowd. That image made the evening news, paired side by side with footage from that night, Rodriguez in full gear, lips curled into a sneer. The contrast was damning and unforgettable. Thompson and Miller had kept their jobs, but not without consequence. They had spent 6 months in mandatory bias training, part of the department's new quarterly requirement. The footage of them on their phones, while flames climbed the walls, had been played in training sessions nationwide, not as a spectacle, but as a warning of how complacency and prejudice can erode professional judgment. By the time they returned to full duty, both men spoke differently to the press. They admitted their shame, called the reforms necessary, even volunteered for community events in neighborhoods they had once ignored. The Riverside Response Tracker had gone beyond city limits. News outlets had covered its launch so extensively that other mayors called DeAndre's office for access. Within 12 weeks, the app was adopted in 21 other cities, each tailoring it to their own emergency services. Civil rights groups called it a blueprint for accountability. Fire chiefs in other states admitted it had changed how they viewed performance, not just for optics, but for survival in an era where every delay could become a headline. In the mayor's office, DeAndre reviewed the latest monthly report. Average response times citywide were down 34%. Complaints about discriminatory service had dropped to near zero. Community satisfaction scores were at a 10-year high. For him, these numbers weren't just statistics. They were proof that the night his house burned hadn't been in vain. Outside City Hall, the public had moved on to other stories, but in the quiet corridors of government, people remembered. Department heads now walked into budget meetings knowing their figures would be cross-checked not just for efficiency, but for equity. Policy proposals carried community impact statements. Even the police department had requested to be added to the response tracker system. The lesson had sunk in. Visibility meant accountability. The twist for those who had doubted it was seeing the very man who had once marked a burning home now shuffling past reporters, saying no comment, his eyes fixed on the ground. That single frame, captured as he stepped down the courthouse stairs, had replaced every image of his former authority. It was a living reminder of what happens when arrogance meets public accountability. In Riverside, the message was clear. The system had changed, and it had teeth. 2 years later, the lot where DeAndre's home once stood was no longer empty. In its place rose a modern training facility for the Riverside Fire Department, open to the public, a place where school groups came to watch live drills and residents learned emergency preparedness side by side with the crews who served them. On this crisp fall morning, a crowd had gathered for the monthly community demonstration. A large digital display towered over the training ground, its numbers glowing in bright red, 342. That was the average citywide response time for the past quarter. It was a number everyone here understood was hard-won. DeAndre stood at the front, not behind a podium, but shoulder to shoulder with neighbors, firefighters, and volunteers. The air carried the scent of fresh paint and the faint metallic tang of hose water from the morning's drills. Behind him, a diverse team of firefighters moved with precise coordination, running a simulated rescue as cameras from local stations recorded every second. These days, drills like this weren't just for training, they were for trust. Across the country, the Riverside model had spread to more than 100 cities. The Response Tracker app was no longer a novelty, but a standard, its green and red indicators visible in municipal buildings and on residents' phones from Chicago to San Diego. In every city that adopted it, the disparities in response times between neighborhoods had vanished within months. What had once been quietly accepted as the way things worked was now openly monitored, impossible to hide. DeAndre spoke without notes, his voice carrying over the hum of the crowd. He reminded them of the night his own emergency call was met with delay and dismissal, how the system had been forced to look at itself in the harsh light of public accountability. That night wasn't about one house, he said, glancing at the building behind him. It was about every house, every family, every call that could be ignored if no one was watching. Now the whole country is watching. There was no bitterness in his tone, only resolve. Around him, heads nodded, not just residents but firefighters too, many of whom had joined the department under the new residency and diversity requirements. Several had stories of their own, moments where the app's transparency had pushed them to move faster, double-check decisions, or speak up when a call seemed mishandled. For some in the crowd, this was the first time seeing DeAndre in person. They knew the viral clips, the press conferences, the policy papers, but here he was simply part of the circle, not above it. When a child asked what the glowing numbers meant, he knelt to explain, describing how every second saved could mean a life saved, and how now, no matter where you lived, those seconds belonged to you too. The display ticked up to 3:43 and then back down to 3:42 as another crew completed a drill. Applause broke out spontaneously, the kind that came from understanding what those numbers represented. The twist for many watching, both here and on the live stream, was realizing that the real victory hadn't been in salvaging a single property. It was in building a system where such a night could not happen again, where no one would have to stand in the street and wonder if help was coming. DeAndre ended with a simple call to action. Keep watching, he told the cameras. Keep asking questions, keep holding us accountable, because the day you stop looking is the day someone decides they can cut corners again, and we're not going back. The crowd responded with the kind of applause that felt less like celebration and more like agreement to a pact. As the demonstration wrapped up, the camera crews lingered, catching shots of residents shaking hands with firefighters, kids trying on helmets, the LED display still holding steady at 3:42. Somewhere in the background, an older woman's voice carried over the noise. "That's how you stop a fire before it starts," she said, and though she meant the drills, it was clear she was talking about something bigger. The fire from that night 2 years ago was long gone, but the change it sparked still burned, steady and bright in every corner of the city. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.